All right, welcome back to Drop Site News Tuesday morning live stream for a variety of reasons that are too boring to get into. We had tried to move this live stream to Thursday morning, as you may have noticed. Didn't work out terribly well. So here we are back for now on Tuesday morning. So this Tuesday morning, I'll be joined by my colleague, Jeremy Scahill, to talk about yesterday's UN Security Council vote on what the New York Times is calling a peace plan for Gaza. We'll get into exactly what they voted on and what it means and what the resistance is saying in response to it. After that, we'll be joined by the anti-imperialist Mexican journalist José Luis Granados Ceja, who was at the right-wing opposition party protests this weekend in Mexico City. And he'll break down for us what he saw there and what you're actually seeing in the streets of Mexico City, contrary to what you're hearing from the Western press about it. And then after that, we'll be joined by our Indian correspondent, Siddharthya Roy, to talk about the rising tensions between India and Pakistan. There have been a number of explosions in both Pakistan and India. There is a sense among people who are watching this closely that a second round of the war might be just around the corner. Yet India, interestingly, has walked back from blaming Pakistan for these recent Delhi explosions, which is good news for at least the postponement of this second round. But we'll talk to Sid about what he's seeing there and where this might be headed. But to start, Jeremy Scahill, thank you so much for being here on our Tuesday morning stream. So good timing for it, because yesterday afternoon, the United Nations took up this Trump plan and here let me show how the New York Times headlined it. They say, in major breakthrough, UN Security Council adopts U.S. peace plan for Gaza. Russia and China abstained in the vote, which provides a legal mandate for the Trump administration's vision of how to move past the ceasefire to rebuild the war-ravaged enclave after 2 years of war. So what is in this quote-unquote peace plan, and what do you think of the description of it as from the New York Times as a peace plan?
I mean, the New York Times characterization of this is so outrageously factually false that we could spend an entire show just discussing the dynamics here with how the New York Times is reporting on this, and then looking at the context of the 2+ years of genocide and how the New York Times at crucial moments has always stepped in to launder the Israeli narrative. But to zoom out and talk about what happened last night at the UN, this was an extraordinary move on the part of the UN Security Council. In fact, I was looking back and trying to find any evidence that the Security Council endorsed a plan of this nature ever in the history of the UN. And I'm pretty certain that we've never seen anything like this. Why do I say that? What essentially the UN Security Council has done is to endorse the deployment of what clearly is a Trump, not even US led, because Trump has made himself the chairman of this so-called Board of Peace that is going to oversee the occupation and administration of Gaza as a sort of Bantustan, for all practical purposes. And what the UN has done is authorize Trump's board to deploy a international force of foreign occupiers inside of Gaza that is not under the command and control of the United Nations, that doesn't resemble a peacekeeping force, but instead has among its primary missions the disarmament and demilitarization of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people who have endured a genocide for more than 2 years, who have waged a 77-year battle for national liberation, on principles that are firmly rooted in international law. And so what the UN has done here is to put an international stamp of legitimacy on what is a privatized plan being implemented by what I think we can call the US-Israeli axis, and imposing it on the Palestinian people. It does nothing to push forward any discourse around the establishment of a Palestinian state. It keeps Israel indefinitely occupying large swaths of Gaza. Right now, Israel is in control of roughly 53% of the Gaza Strip. It also links the issue of the delivery of life essentials, food, medicine, construction equipment, reconstruction equipment, entirely to the disarmament of the Palestinians. Everyone talks about Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. But let's remove Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad as specifics from this equation and just look at the raw fact of what this resolution does. It endorses Israel's war of subjugation and apartheid by saying that the Palestinians stand alone in the world as the only people that do not have a right to self-determination or to resist occupation, including through the force of arms. This is an extraordinarily dark moment in the history of the United Nations. And the U.S. Envoy to the UN, Mike Waltz, really issued a kind of menacing statement last night where he said that if this resolution is not adopted, it means a return to war. What does he mean? He means a return to the genocide. So, I think one of the most shameful aspects of this also is that you had the endorsement a couple of days ago of this effort led by the Trump administration to put this stamp of international legitimacy on his privatized plan to occupy and colonize Gaza. It was endorsed by major Arab-Islamic countries in the world, including Egypt and others. And it also was endorsed by the kind of Vichy regime of Mahmoud Abbas, who is technically the head of the Palestinian Authority and operates under the banner of the state of Palestine at the UN. But Mahmoud Abbas's popularity, his legitimacy, is totally in the toilet. There are recent polls that indicate that Hamas remains the #1 most popular political party in all of Palestine, not just in Gaza. And so you had this assembly of all of these bootlickers who endorsed a United Nations effort to put a stamp of legitimacy on Donald Trump's and Benjamin Netanyahu's agenda for the Palestinian people. It's a sickening day, to be quite honest.
Yeah. So what does it say about our current politics that this was able to get through? Like, I think a lot of people followed this genocide and thought that the standing of Israel geopolitically around the world, had suffered grievously from carrying out a genocide 24/7 on people, just people watching it on their phones for 2 straight years. Here we are weeks after the quote unquote ceasefire, and Russia and China abstain, and the rest of the countries on the Security Council just rubber stamp this plan. So what are people missing? Like what is going on here that is allowing this to move forward?
Well, as we're speaking, Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, a brutal butcher, human rights violator, a client of the United States, is arriving in Washington, D.C. for another one of his tours where he's being feted at the White House. Trump is saying that they're going to move forward with the sale of advanced fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. There's talk that Trump wants this linked to Saudi Arabia joining the so-called Abraham Accords, normalization agreements with Israel. Trump earlier this year had his grand tour of the Persian Gulf, where he went to all of these Gulf Arab capitals and hung out with the emirs of various countries, picked up his $400 million plane. And also I think that we have to see Trump not simply as the president of the United States, but also as a mafia don who is thinking primarily about his family business. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his venture capital firm, Affinity Partners, is bankrolled by many of the Gulf states that are now deeply involved with Trump's plan. So I think one aspect of this is that this is business. And it's not necessarily the business of the US government. It's also the business of the Trump family. Both Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff.
Yeah. Trump organization too.
And the Trump organization.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, Steve Witkoff, also a big real estate guy, his son, in advance of Witkoff supposedly being the lead negotiator alongside Jared Kushner in achieving this deal, his son was meeting with, representatives of Gulf states talking about trying to strike new business deals. Witkoff says, I'm kind of divested from the business, but his son, similar to the Trump model, is over there trying to strike these deals. So that's one part of it. The flip side of that coin, Ryan, is that Trump has proven very effective at whipping countries to take the knee in front of him. And it's particularly visible when you see the response from Arab and Islamic countries that pay a lot of lip service to the idea that the Palestinians deserve a state. And what their role has been here is to offer Israel an unprecedented level of the appearance of support from Arab and Islamic countries to what at the end of the day remains an agenda of Israeli annihilation and the blocking of an actual independent Palestinian state.
So there's still the problem on the ground that, Israel, despite everything that did over the last, 2 years, was not able to defeat the resistance inside Gaza. They're still armed. Israel controls, as you said, roughly half of the Gaza Strip, but not all of it by any stretch of the imagination. So you can vote on something at the United Nations, but what does it take to go from there to the actual execution of this plan? Who are the troops that are supposed to disarm Islamic Jihad and Hamas, and what countries are going to do this? And why do they think they'll be able to accomplish that where the IDF could not?
I mean, remember that the existence of the Palestinian resistance and the refusal to raise the white flag in the face of this genocide and to continue fighting and to continue inflicting losses on the occupation forces is a stain on the houses of all of these royal monarchies in the Arab world, who stood by and either did nothing except issue occasional strongly worded statements, or at crucial times actually aided and abetted Israel when other nations tried to intervene to confront Israel, over the genocide. On a practical level, Ryan, what we saw last night and this morning were a series of statements issued not just by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but by a broad cross-section of Palestinian political groups. You and I have talked about this before, that while media coverage always just says Hamas, the reality is that for most of the duration of this genocide, it hasn't just been Hamas that's been making decisions on how to respond to the edicts of Trump or Netanyahu or Biden before that, or to these proposals that are characterized as ceasefire agreements. There's a wide cross-section of Palestinian political leaders and groups that are consulted. I just got back from meeting with a wide range of Palestinian leaders. Some of them represent Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but others, like Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, are political figures that don't control an armed force. They're all on the same side. And I just want to read for you a statement that we got this morning, or part of a statement that we got this morning. And again, when people listen to this, remember, this is not Hamas issuing a statement. This is a broad cross-section of Palestinian society that, as far as I understand it, includes nearly every political faction in Palestine, with the exception of Mahmoud Abbas's forces within the Fatah movement. Fatah is splitting. There is an alternative political body that is rising up. So, as you listen to me read this, remember, this is not just Hamas. This is not Islamic Jihad. This is a wide cross-section of Palestinian political movements, some of which have competed against Hamas in elections, including Mustafa Barghouti. But this was their statement about the Security Council resolution. They said the Palestinian forces and factions affirm their commitment to our people's right to self-defense and reject the Security Council resolution, deeming it a tool for Israeli control and complicity in the genocide of our people. The Palestinian factions reiterate their rejection of the resolution, viewing it as a U.S.-backed decision that violates international security frameworks and paves the way for Israeli actions on the ground against the will of the Palestinian people. We believe that any international force deployed in Gaza in its proposed form will amount to a form of trusteeship or administration, thereby perpetuating a reality that restricts the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. So they go on and they also say that there is a non-negotiable right that the Palestinians have to all forms of resistance, including armed resistance. What the UN has done here is to create a structure where they're saying, we're not deploying an international force that's going to play a peacekeeping role. I spoke to some of the leadership of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which doesn't participate in elections organized by the Palestinian Authority, that operates a significant armed force in both Gaza and the West Bank, Soraya al-Quds. And one of their top leaders told me before this vote happened, we are open to the deployment of international force. We don't object to it. But that international force has to be there to implement the ceasefire and to ensure that anything that's agreed upon is implemented on the ground. And so and this was the position of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all of the Palestinian factions. It wasn't that they were objecting even to foreigners coming in,
right.
which is quite extraordinary. The Palestinians were saying, but it can't be something that is a collaboration force aimed at crushing our right to resistance, which is exactly what happened. There's another detail that hasn't gotten much attention buried in this, Ryan, and that says if you look at term 7 of this UN resolution, it also says that this international force is going to be working not only with Egypt, but with the, quote, state of Israel on the very issue of demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, including the destruction and prevention of rebuilding of the military terror and offensive infrastructure, as well as the permanent decommissioning of weapons from non-state armed groups. What this says is that this international force, now endorsed by the UN, is going to include the involvement of Israel in disarming the very people that it's been trying to annihilate from this world. I mean, this is extraordinary that the United Nations did this. And it's also shameful, I think, just on a moral level. Russia and China had the ability to veto this. The United States has systematically vetoed every resolution that would have endorsed a real ceasefire in this Gaza war. And Russia and China sat this out. So you have this reality now where the Palestinian people across the political spectrum are facing a continuation of the war of annihilation through a UN resolution that endorses not the US government running a private occupation force, but Donald Trump. And it endorses it through 2027. And Donald Trump is the chair of the so-called Board of Peace. It's an extraordinary moment. It's a vicious diplomatic move that was endorsed by the United Nations.
So what would a foreign troop intervention in Gaza look like that abided by the principles of the ceasefire? Like what?
You mean from the Palestinian side, like
from
what
the
I've been hearing from people?
Yeah.
I mean, look, I think that all Palestinians that I spoke to recognize that they're dealing with a very complicated reality with Trump's agenda, because you're dealing with an erratic person who views the US government at this moment as his private vessel to ensure that the Trump organization, his family businesses, his cronies are all set up long term. And that's part of how they got all of these Arab and Islamic countries on board, because there's business deals being made here. And so I think from the Palestinian perspective, even though there's a complicated history with UN peacekeeping forces, I think their belief was that the only way that the world could manifest its almost universal opposition to this genocide, its almost universal embrace of the idea of the cause of liberation of the Palestinian people, is to have troops that are on the ground that come from a variety of nations, that are not linked to the genocidal forces of the Israeli entity, that are not under the direct control of Donald Trump, who's made clear that he is fully behind Israel in this. And that their belief was that this would have allowed a space where the Palestinian side would have some relative peace, an end to the acute genocide, to try to discuss how to establish a Palestinian state that would keep the occupied West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem, and Gaza as one entity. Because remember, as we reported, when the Palestinian side, quote unquote, accepted Trump's plan, that's not actually what they did. Even no matter what Trump says, no matter how he wants to talk about 3,000 years of history, Hamas and Islamic Jihad were empowered by the other Palestinian groups to negotiate a ceasefire, an exchange of captives, and terms for the resumption of delivery of life essentials into the Gaza Strip. All the other issues, they said, have to be discussed with a broader cross-section. Now, what's interesting is Trump's people are trying to get Arab states to agree to deploy troops as part of this force. And my understanding is none of them have come forward and said, oh yeah, we'd like to put our troops there. Why? Because you then have the prospect of not just these states doing nothing to stop Israel, but now they're going to be the agents operating at the behest of Israel and Trump to go and disarm Hamas, to disarm Islamic Jihad, to disarm the Palestinian people. Saudi Arabia and the UAE from the very beginning really wanted Israel to crush Hamas. Why? Because the existence of the armed resistance in Palestine is a pox on their houses.
Yeah.
Because, all over the Arab world, oh, the Zionist entity, oh, this state has an official policy. We're at war with the Zionist entity. Okay, you're at war. Have you done anything in that war? You know, are you going to do anything about the fact that they're burning children alive every day, that they're destroying mosques, that you have Israeli terrorists known as settlers that are running around burning the Quran, that they're raping prisoners, that nearly 100 Palestinians have been murdered inside of Israeli prisons since October 7th happened? You know, are you going to do anything about this? No. And so now what your action is on the ground is going to be to serve as the like sort of death squads for the Israelis. None of these countries are saying, oh yeah, we're going to put our forces in there. So, you know, Trump's talking to some non-Arab Islamic countries to try to see if they're willing to deploy forces. They're also, Egypt is training supposedly a quote unquote Palestinian police force. You know, all of this really though, look, I talk regularly to people from the Palestinian resistance, and my sincere sense was that they were interested in making concessions all the way to a point where they still felt that they could preserve the cause of self-determination. And at every turn, they had violence meted out against them, culminating with an attempt to murder the negotiating delegation on September 9th in a series of Israeli airstrikes in Doha, Qatar. So, you know, the last thing I'll say about this, we are in the midst of one of the most epic lies in history. We are told that the Palestinian resistance is terrorism. If you study the history of self-determination, of anti-colonialism, of fights against apartheid, nothing about the Palestinian actions here falls outside of the scope of the types of actions we've seen in other causes of national liberation. You can debate tactics, we can talk about specific incidents, but if you look at the overarching framework, we are told to believe that these are terrorists, like some foreign body that has come into the region. These are the Palestinian people that are descendants of the Nakba. These are Palestinian people that have grown up knowing nothing but siege, starvation, war against them. So, you know, I think part of the chains that are being broken right now in the world is that young people and free-thinking people are recognizing the lies that have been told. This is one of the most legitimate causes, I think, just objectively speaking, one of the most legitimate causes of national liberation in the history of humanity. And so, you know, these states have to ask themselves, which side are we going to be on? Up until now, by default or by action, they've been on the side of Israel.
So I still don't understand how they plan to execute this. So I guess so. You get some Indonesian troops, are they using life essentials again? As you said, they're tying life essentials to the execution of this. And
I suspect we're going to see private contractors start to become a major point of discussion. To be honest, Ryan. You know, this is also kind of what happened in U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, Trump, I think, is reluctant to deploy a large number of U.S. boots on the ground. Yes, you have, you know, roughly 200 Americans that are on the ground right now in this sort of quote unquote unified command center that is, you know, overseeing what's happening in Gaza right now. But I don't think Trump's going to want to stick American boots on the ground in any large format. He could change his mind on that. So I think you know, there will be some states certainly to try to win favor with Trump that are going to be willing to offer up some troops. But my guess is that you're going to have a very large tail, as they call it in military terminology, of private contractors that if they want to implement this, they're going to have to necessarily deploy. And so you could have a situation where former U.S. military, former special operations guys from the United States are deployed as part of this force, or British, or, you know, German, or what have you. That's the model that's been in existence for a while. But I think Arab and Islamic countries are very, very nervous about deploying their people, particularly if the primary mission is demilitarization of a just liberation cause.
Well, Colombia's Petro has talked about sending, you know, international troops there, but we may end up getting Colombians in there actually.
That's what we're seeing in Sudan and right. Elsewhere. And, you know, I mean, I wonder also, you know, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see if he comes back into play here. He's very close to Jared Kushner. He's close to some of Trump's sons. In the first Trump administration, you know, he was constantly coming in and out of meetings at the White House discussing his various plans for how private forces could be used around the world. But on this Colombia issue, you know, I met with the senior advisor to President Petro of Colombia last week, and, you know, he senior advisor on Palestine, and was asking him about this Uniting for Peace resolution. What is a Uniting for Peace resolution? It means that if the UN Security Council, if a member of the UN Security Council is blocking action that would be necessary to for example, confront a genocide. The United Nations General Assembly can circumvent the UN Security Council and deploy a force. And, this wouldn't be a force that's going to like go to war against Israel. It's effectively it would be a force that would put itself between the aggressor and the victims, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And, this was gaining some momentum, I was told. But then when this Trump plan started to gain more momentum, and you saw the endorsement of the plan coming from Arab and Islamic countries, and then the key to it was that you get Abbas because he has this card that says, "Oh, I'm the one that speaks for the Palestinians," even though his popularity is like 10% right now. Once that happened, the Colombians said, "Okay, we're going to pull back on this. Watch how this unfolds." They're saying that they're not dropping the idea of a uniting for peace resolution, but they've essentially put it on a form of pause right now. I think that's been disappointing to a lot of people who felt that this would have been an opportunity, a historic opportunity for the UN General Assembly to confront the fact that the U.S. was vetoing all of these ceasefire resolutions. But now it's a complicated situation. The UN, with Russia and China stepping aside, Russia and China allowed an unprecedented thing to happen, which is the UN endorsing a foreign military force to deploy in historic Palestine that will be under the command of a man named Donald Trump. This is again, I keep reiterating it. It's mind-blowing what's happened here.
Last question for you. What do you understand about the conditions inside Gaza now? There's been a lot of good reporting about the way that Israel is withholding essentials such as tents, stakes, like any types of equipment needed to rebuild. We've seen flooding and really difficult weather lately. We're now getting into another cold season, and that's aside from the problems that so many people were having with malnutrition. What are you hearing about what the reduction in bombing, because not a cessation of it, but at least a reduction of bombing and the allowing in of some life essentials. What has that done for conditions?
One fact that a senior Hamas official told me over the weekend, who sort of is dealing with helping to coordinate, because Hamas remains the governing authority there, so they have access to statistics and what's happening on the ground, because their people as civil servants are involved with this, said that there was supposed to be 600 trucks per day that are entering Gaza, and at times on some days you do have hundreds of trucks that have come in. But what he said is that when we've audited what has come in many cases, 2/3 or more of what has been delivered is for commercial purposes, which means that Palestinians can be, it goes to businesses, which means that, Palestinians can then be subjected to having to pay enormously high prices just to get basic life essentials. That's not an accident, it's by design. So it's still reinforcing this Hunger Games atmosphere to try to keep the Palestinians desperate. We shouldn't even use the term humanitarian aid. Israel, under international law, remains the occupying power. They're not giving aid to the Palestinians when trucks come in. We're talking about bare essentials. We're talking about life essentials. So, I think that, yes, it's true that the massive scorched earth bombing has ended. You have Israel still doing military strikes. You still have Israeli forces shooting and killing Palestinians, but in a far reduced state. But the generalized state of siege still exists. And now what the UN has done has been to put before the Palestinian people essentially a threat that is rooted in 77 years of war of annihilation, which is, if you don't bend the knee, if you don't accept apartheid and subjugation, the only option we're leaving you is armed resistance. So, if the aim is to end armed resistance in Palestine, there's a clear path to that. Right. Establish a Palestinian state. Allow the Palestinians to have an army capable of defending itself. Address the fact that Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons. Address the fact that no one talks about disarming Israel. This is the biggest state terrorist in the region, and they're being treated as though they have the mandate to be running around with an international force, disarming the people that they're committing genocide against. That's why the Palestinians rightly say this is an attempt to win for Israel through this cajoled blackmail agreement that the UN has now rubber stamped, what they never have been able to achieve through force, which is murdering every single Palestinian or forcing them into fourth-class residency in a territory that's made up of tiny little cantons that are administered by collaborators masquerading as Palestinian officials.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jeremy, thank you for the update. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah. All right. So next, I'm going to welcome in José Luis Granados, Ceja, journalist in Mexico City. Here we go. Jose, thanks so much for joining us. I mentioned at the top of the show, you guys have been covering the protests this weekend down in Mexico City, and the coverage up here in the United States has been look at Gen Z, look at the youth. They're angry at the cartels, they're angry at corruption, they're angry at cost of living, and they're rising up against the tyranny of Claudia Sheinbaum. So you went there yourself. I did want to put up one funny image that did circulate and kind of cut through this a little bit, and then I want to get your reaction here. Here is one of the funniest images I've ever seen from a protest. There's this is the One Piece symbol, which you saw in South Korea. Some recent protests kind of become a symbol of like Gen Z resistance. I can't tell if this Vicente Fox here thinks people won't recognize him in his shades and hat if he dons a One Piece hat.
He's claiming that's not him. He's saying that's not him, but it sure does look like him. Yeah, that's his claim. I'll give him.
Okay,
I'll give
fine.
him that much.
Whoever that is, he's not doing a very good Gen Z impersonation. So in any event, what did you see when you went to these protests, and how did they compare to like other kind of protests that you've seen against other governments?
Yeah, in your lead up, I think you hit the nail on the head. Very much their intention was to transmit this message that Mexico, like other countries here in Latin America that are experiencing a profound political process of change, obviously with the election of López Obrador in 2018, kind of the first left-wing government in Mexico in a very long time, arguably since the 30s. And then, he very much was putting himself forward as a transformational candidate. Things have, really changed here in Mexico, and the opposition has struggled to try to respond to that. They haven't really ever kind of found footing in this new political reality in Mexico. And I think the election results of 2024 also speak to that Claudia Sheinbaum not only builds on López Obrador's legacy, but actually expands his coalition, wins by an even larger margin, just an overwhelming landslide win. And so what we've seen from the opposition are these attempts to try to kind of latch on to other issues because their own brand, for lack of a better word, just has no currency anymore. They're very much discredited, the parties of the old regime here in Mexico. And we saw it around election mobilizations, around the electoral authority, the INE, but we also saw it with this most recent demonstration. So it's important to give that context because this all actually started back in October. There was this AI-generated video, this very much AstroTurf. I love that term. I love that we can use it in English. I wish we had an equivalent in Spanish. But this AstroTurf campaign, fake grassroots, where you
don't have AstroTurf in Mexico?
We do, but the term doesn't have the same kind of meaning there. Yeah, and soccer's the bigger sport here. They play on natural grass as opposed to that turf that destroys people's knees.
Here
in
we
American
even play
football.
soccer on AstroTurf, and
it's
we
awful.
Give all the players cancer. But go ahead.
And so, this AstroTurf campaign starts to make some noise, and it turns out that some other journalists did some digging in, and like the websites were registered to former operatives associated with the PRI. They were all following social media accounts that were very much linked with the sort of NGO opposition, but also the formal political opposition here. And
US-funded NGOs or
they're mostly oligarch funded here in Mexico.
Okay.
This is I know that there's been a lot of talk about foreign interference, and there certainly has been. I think we've seen actors from the international right active, actually even coming here in Mexico to participate in these protests. But these are very much local oligarchs, Mexican oligarchs who are funding this. Claudio X González, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, who are kind of the big enemies right now of the Fourth Transformation, the name of the movement that López Obrador started and Claudia Sheinbaum also represents. And so things really start to change, though, in November when Carlos Manso, so he is this mayor from Uruapan, Michoacan. Michoacan is one of those states that has been heavily impacted by organized crime. It was the state where Felipe Calderón, way back in 2006, launched his so-called war on the cartels. It's one of the states most affected. It's also one of the poorest. And Uruapan is, of course, no exception inside of Michoacan. And he had a hard line. So his position was, we have to go after the cartels with everything, kind of echoing some of the similar language of Felipe Calderón, of a very militarized, aggressive, security first kind of approach, although he was also critical of Felipe Calderón. And because of that, it's believed now, it's widely understood that he was targeted by organized crime groups in that region because of his opposition to them. And I think some of the outrage we've seen around this, because of course security is a major issue here in Mexico. It's one of those that, there has been progress, but it's still a major issue, especially things around kind of that affect quality of life, the extortions and the kind of racketeering that happens here in Mexico. Less so the kind of the more violent crimes. Those are the ones where we've seen actually a really important improvement. And so what we saw was the opposition, both the NGO and the political opposition, latch onto this, as they did with the electoral.
He was assassinated, correct?
He was assassinated by organized crime.
Real quickly, what were the circumstances?
So he was at a Day of the Dead event, a very public event. The details are still not quite clear. He did have protection from the National Guard, which is this federal security force that López Obrador created. He dissolved the former corrupt federal police, creates the National Guard, and he did have some protection from them. But according to the reports from the Attorney General here in Mexico, the National Guard was assigned to kind of periphery duty, and his closest contacts, his bodyguards, were of his people he trusted individually. And there's video of the scene right before it happens. There's an actual video of the actual assassination, but you can see that his security guards are not necessarily around him, protecting him. And it looks like it was actually a very young person, a 17-year-old, who actually was paid to carry out this. Of course, here in Mexico, it's kind of easy in a way to pay somebody to kill somebody. Right. The interesting thing is always who was the intellectual author, who was the mastermind behind this. And of course, it produced a very sincere, and I think it's important to say this, outrage. It is an example of what happens when organized crime makes the decision to carry out a political assassination. It'd be interesting to see, again, if there are other actors involved there, but that is kind of the line of investigation that the state is operating under. But then this Gen Z transformation, which at first was about, calling for a revocation of mandate. We have here in Mexico at the middle of a president's term, you can actually hold a referendum and try to recall them. They were pushing for this, but as soon as this assassination happens, then it becomes about the security situation. And we saw, a huge mobilization from the political opposition, from the NGO opposition here to try to make noise about it, which is within their right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But this notion that it is a Gen Z protest, organic, that's, emerged from online discussions of a generation, of a part of the population, a segment of the population that is upset with the president and therefore feels like this is the only option available to them, that part is totally artificial. There is discontent. There is obviously a political opposition, but all of this kind of narrative that Mexico is, in a crisis and, they've been overwhelmed by organized crime and the population is upset with an unpopular government is a total fabrication. Claudia Sheinbaum remains immensely popular. She has above 70%, almost 80% approval, and amongst young people with above 60 to 70% amongst 18 to 30 approximately. So it gives you an idea of what conditions actually are on the ground. And I think what we saw on Saturday, kind of get into the details of the actual clashes that we saw inside of the Zócalo, the big public square here in Mexico City. I think they were very much meant to happen. It was their objective to see these kinds of scenes precisely. So you get comments like from Donald Trump that we saw yesterday. Oh, I saw what's going on and things are not so good down in Mexico. It's all about trying to install this narrative that Mexico is run by a narco state. And it responds to the political demands of the opposition here, which, having nothing left in their hands to actually kind of be able to confront this government, is now trying to destabilize it.
Like manufacture a destabilization. I want to get to those scenes in a second, but so you and your colleagues were at the protests, and oh Christ, I can't get this to play. Okay, here we go.
¿Preferías a Donald Trump, presidente de México,
and you interviewed some of these young people.
Veces, sí.
So young.
¿Qué le parece sobre Donald Trump?
Que está haciendo un buen trabajo.
¿Y qué le parece sobre la militarización de los Estados Unidos?
Pues que también igual, si estuviera aquí como el país, tampoco no estaría bien.
Well, he has good things and other things that we are not.
What would you say some of the good things are?
Well, he protects the life. I mean, the newborn, okay?
Abortion.
Abortion. He's against abortion, okay?
De Donald Trump. A mí me parece un buen presidente. A lo mejor no es lo mejor que hay. Sin embargo, si hubiera quedado Kamala, yo creo que la situación sería peor, porque Kamala junto con Biden son algo muy parecido a lo que es López Obrador. Y por eso se permitieron muchas cosas en Estados Unidos. La llegada de muchos emigrantes, muchos narcos hay allá, y todo fue por la complicidad de Biden con López Obrador, con el gobierno de Morena. Por eso se invadieron de narcos y de delincuentes.
All right, so when you're looking around the protest square, first of all, how big was it compared to what people were claiming? And what kind of types of people are you seeing as someone who's covered a bunch of these different protests? A lot of usual suspects or some surprising elements?
I think it's very much a lot of the usual suspects. You can see even just by that clip, right? The sort of the class and white composition of this, which is very much middle class, upper class, the kind of usual political opposition to López Obrador, to Claudia Sheinbaum. And they have successfully demonstrated in large numbers before. The term that was used here to kind of represent them was the pink tide, the Marea Rosa. This was all around the protests against changes to the electoral authority here in Mexico. But in comparison to those demonstrations that they held in 2023 and 2024, that were very much always linked to the political opposition, is actually smaller. The amount of people that turned out on Saturday was far less compared to that. And you can actually see it because, you know, you can always measure by how much the Zócalo actually gets filled. It holds about 150 if it's really quite packed, and it wasn't even half full. And also the images from on the ground and seeing from the protests, you can see that it wasn't as full as usual. So much so that we've actually seen a lot of the people who have been, you know, trying to instrumentalize these protests using images from a zombie walk that happened earlier this year to try to claim it was this demonstration, trying to give a false image of how large it was. Was there a turnout? Sure. I mean, absolutely. There is a part of this population which, you know, carries forward that tradition of marching out into the streets and showing their opposition, right? But I think it's very much some of those usual suspects, especially the first bit. So this started in the Zócalo and then marched down Paseo de la Reforma, the Ángel de Independencia, the Angel. Anybody who's been to Mexico City is probably familiar with it. Down the big avenue, Paseo de la Reforma, trying to make it to the Zócalo there. And that first march, I think, was very much what you would expect to see from the traditional opposition here, you know, the usual slogans and expressing their discontent. Some political faces that are well known to Mexicans were there. But then it's the scene in the Zócalo where things seems to change, right? And I think there's an important thing to point out there, which is that in any demonstration in Mexico, at the end point, there's usually a stage and there's usually a speaker. There's an attempt to give a kind of political character, political content to the demonstration. That didn't happen this year, despite the heavy mobilization that some of these groups actually did. And I think that was very much intentional. They were trying to set the table, trying to create this scene, because the images that have been circulating on social media that we've seen of these clashes between the provocateurs, between these shock groups and the police, they were already on site. They were already there in the Zócalo, and it just kind of seemed like all of the ingredients were in place precisely to produce these kinds of scenes. And some of those older actors that we've already seen before, talking about the head of Frente Cívico Nacional, Acosta Naranjo, for example, all of them disappeared. There was a TV station here, TV Azteca, which is owned by Ricardo Salinas Pliegos, which has a lot of issues with the Mexican government. You know, he was all out, right? All day coverage, round the clock, sending his star reporters there with bodyguards to cover this demonstration. And then as soon as the scene starts to get more conflictive, those people all disappeared. They all kind of left the area. And I think that is quite telling, because they were trying to set up this scenario precisely that we ended up seeing play out.
Yeah. So what were we looking at on the scenes that I was playing? And I'll play another one while we're responding. Like how significant were these? How many people are involved? And did they end up kind of breaching anything, or was it more just kind of course, drama for the sake of drama.
So what we saw in the actual square,
And
when
there's
you'll see
there's
some of
another
these,
one-piece flag.
these images here. So the National Palace is the seat of government. It's like the White House, but it's literally on a public square. So it's quite easy to get close to in normal times. When there's obviously demonstrations where there's intelligence that suggests that these kinds of incidents are going to happen, what the state does is put up these metal fences. And in fact, on social media, there was all kinds of talk about how to tear them down. People would show up with, saws to try to cut the pieces that kind of hold it all together. They brought chains and ropes. There's clearly a coordinated strategy to try to bring down these fences, because the point was to try to repeat some of the scenes that we did see from places like Nepal, where these kind of one-piece flags are drawing inspiration from, to actually storm the National Palace, which again is the seat of the federal executive, to burn it down, to try to send this message. And so when we started seeing these agitators start to kind of attack and break things down, there was something really interesting there that I think is worth highlighting here, which is that these kinds of protests are not uncommon in Mexico. There is a very active Black Bloc, especially in Mexico City, and they've been active long before the Fourth Transformation, and they're likely active long after. This was not the Black Bloc.
It's like the anarchist types that we've got here in the U.S.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're at every protest. There's like a dozen or two of them just messing around. Yeah.
These are paid shock groups. So we call them Porros here.
So the ones here are paid shock groups, right?
Very much so. And you can tell there's an image there that I shared with you. It's a video I recorded right in front of the National Palace, close to the Supreme Court, which is right next door, where you can see an individual is actually kind of instructing all the different people on how to move and what to attack and all the rest of it. And that part is really quite telling. It was clearly a coordinated strategy with people who are being paid to do so.
I mean,
this is not an uncommon feature in Mexican politics that people are paid to kind of disrupt events, but this was just to a higher, much more intense degree.
Which one was that? I'll play it again.
There's one, it's a horizontal video, but even the vertical video shows actually the same individual coordinating actions. The ones of the actual clashes that I shared on my social media there.
What was the caption of?
The caption was, let me just find that real quick. As predicted, the Gen Z protest in Mexico has descended into
that one. Let me pull that up.
Yeah,
that was one I played earlier. Let me just. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, sorry, I don't want to spoil it for anybody because I'm watching it here in the background here. Yeah.
And as soon as it comes up, I can sort of walk the viewers through it. You can see how there's, like I said, it's very much a coordinated action. And there's also another video you can see there.
So this guy here that you're filming, he's like,
and he was constantly doing that, coordinating and sort of mobilizing the different people who were willing to kind of go up and try to tear down these fences. And they did successfully tear them down, which led to some of those other scenes that you've seen of the police responding. They usually use the extinguishers. So they use extinguishers to kind of repel people away. And there's some dispute as to whether or not tear gas was used. It seems to me that while the general rule in Mexico City is that tear gas is not to be used, they do have some kind of chemical irritant that is used in addition to the extinguishers. So that's why you see some of these things to kind of basically prevent them from successfully knocking down the rest of the fences and being able to. And of course, it was a very drawn out battle between the police and these demonstrators that took over 3.5 hours to wrap up, to finally kind of clear the Zócalo of all of this and for it to and then there were sporadic clashes throughout the different parts of downtown Mexico City over the course of the night. But I mean, for me, the emphasis has to be on that. Even though these kinds of clashes, we saw them on October 2nd, for example, which is the anniversary of the massacre here, where there's often a large presence of the Black Bloc. They have nothing in common. This is very much. We even saw videos of people threatening the police openly, saying, "We've come here with weapons. We're going to kill you," to try to intimidate.
That's not
them.
Black Bloc. Yeah,
and that's not Black Bloc, right?
Yeah.
They have a little bit more discipline, I would think, than to say that. And so, it's widely believed that they were paid by political actors who are interested in promoting this destabilization, to try to put forward this narrative, as I said previously, that Mexico is on the brink of collapse, that it's a narco state, that it's been overwhelmed, which again is not true for all of us who actually do live and work here in Mexico.
Now, what's been the response from the government and the public so far?
So we've seen the president. She holds her morning press conference yesterday. She spent a good time responding to it. She was highlighting, obviously,
Also,
the violent.
pause on that. This is really a really cool thing she does. Like every morning for how long?
Every morning for an hour and a half to 2 hours.
That's wild.
Every morning around 7 a.m. it starts, 7:30 around then. It's kind of almost like a political talk show, TV show, because she'll actually invite her secretaries, the ministers, to come and address and talk about it. For example, yesterday they talked a lot about education programs. They had the Secretary for Public Education there. But it's also an opportunity where she can interact with the press. And obviously the first question yesterday was along these lines: what do you think about what happened? And she obviously was stressing the her condemnation of the violence. Morena was born as a political movement first. It became a political party later, and she's always kind of emphasized that we come from the streets, we defend the right to protest, but we've always done so peacefully. And these kinds of demonstrations, which are linked to far right actors internationally, are looking to disrupt things here. And obviously, she announced that there would be prosecutions, I think, trying to get to the money behind this, who is actually promoting these kinds of things, because they, I think, are right to be weary about or cautious about what's coming next, because, this is very much the Latin America playbook. We've seen it in other countries in Latin America. When you can't really mobilize much public support, there is this tendency amongst the right in this region to want to pursue these destabilization plots in the face of having so little support amongst the population. Again, I have to stress this: Gadi Scheinbaum, 70% approval ratings. These are astronomical, especially if you compare them to the rest of the world.
While we have you, just real quickly, wanted to do a quick tour of the Latin America. So we're looking at a runoff in Chile between the current kind of social democratic left-wing government there, which beat the kind of Pinochet descendant in the last round of the elections, 4 or 5 years ago. But maybe I lose track of all time. The last election that was held down there. But they seem like they're back and are surging. Like, when is this election, and if the right does win, is the right expected to win, and what do you expect to see if they do?
So it's looking like it's going to be a runoff between Jara, who comes from the Communist Party and was a member of Boric's government there, although she's tried to somewhat distance herself from her party and from the previous government because they are somewhat unpopular there in Chile. And she's going to be facing off with Kast, who was the runoff candidate of the right in the last election against Boric. The tricky thing is that if you look at the results from the first round, Chile has a 2-round voting process. If nobody gets 50% in the first round, they go to a second. That although Jara got first place, it was a very narrow victory, and the rest of the field is largely made up of right-wing candidates. So it's quite likely that they are going to align themselves with the other candidate that's left in the race here in the second round, Kast. And although votes don't always automatically translate, she definitely faces an uphill battle if she thinks she's going to be able to kind of defeat the united right in this. And the thing is that Kast very much represents a very hard right, a far right, as opposed to kind of the more moderate post-dictatorship, centrist, center-right governments that kind of ruled. It was always kind of a trade-off between the center-left and the center-right. In fact, Boric kind of broke with that tradition, coming from a political movement that wasn't from this traditional kind of duopoly that emerged after the dictatorship. But I think a lot of what we're seeing in Chile is unfortunately the product of a government that arrived promising to be transformational, promising that they were going to address major things. We have to remember there was a huge social uprising right before Boric was elected that was demanding a new constitution, which is the Pinochet constitution. It was installed by a dictatorship. It should hardly be valid today in 2025. But unfortunately, that vote did not succeed. And then they had a separate process which brought in a right-wing constitution, and that one was also rejected. So they're stuck with the old constitution, which is really quite limiting in terms of the amount of political space it actually affords to non-traditional parties. And I think, the disappointment that a lot of people felt from Boric, that he wasn't able to actually translate his promises into action. And like I said, Jara faces a really big uphill battle. It's quite likely that there's going to be Kast the elected in the second round. Obviously, elections matter. We'll see what can happen. But also, of course, there is a renewed interest by U.S. imperialism in the region. And I think you're seeing a mobilization in support to see if they can do what they can, as they have historically, to try to put in more Washington-friendly governments. And obviously, Kast would be very friendly to Washington. He's kind of the mold of Milei along those lines, of that kind of figure. And I think that's why we're seeing more generally in Latin America is this dispute over the region, because we now have a situation where the United States is very much interested in sort of digging its claws back into the region. I work from this hypothesis that the United States has admitted that it's lost the fight for global hegemony. And in order to be able to dispute it once again with its peer rival, China, it has to regroup and regather its forces. And it thinks the policymakers in Washington think they could do it by turning to the traditional sphere of influence, one of which is Latin America. And so we're going to see more and more interest of Latin America, of the United States in Latin America, especially with actors like Marco Rubio and Christopher Landau in the State Department. And so we'll see what happens as a result of this election. But, for every story like this, there's also some good news. We also saw in Ecuador a very loud rejection of efforts by the U.S.-friendly administration there of Noboa to try to bring in back U.S. military bases into Ecuador, to rewrite the progressive constitution that was promulgated in 2008 under the former leftist president, Rafael Correa. And so that rejection by Ecuadorian voters, I think, is actually pretty important. It shows that—
Pretty overwhelming, right?
It was overwhelming, especially on the question of the military base. There was a huge margin between the votes there, and so those kinds of messages I think are also important, even though there is very much an interest by Marco Rubio.
They literally voted on bringing a U.S. base back to Ecuador.
Yeah, and fortunately, people said no. Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're going to see. We're going to see, if there is right-wing governments elected in the region, these kinds of pushes for closer and closer relationships, up to and including the presence of U.S. troops inside of our territories, which is obviously, for example, here in Mexico, a total non-starter. There isn't a lot of, interest in that. It was something that Claudia Sheinbaum herself said. It's a sign of the moods of Latin America. There may be election results that produce Washington-friendly leaderships, but the mood in Latin America is not to return to these days of the Cold War where they treated us as if we were their backyard.
Right. All right. Jose Luis Granados Ceja. People can find you there's your Twitter handle underneath there, Granados Ceja. Really appreciate you joining me. Really, this is very, very helpful. Let's try to figure out what's going on down there. I look forward to having you back soon.
Anytime. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. See you later. All right. Up next, Siddharthya Roy walking us through. There he is, walking us through what's the latest as India and Pakistan, seem to be on the brink of a second round of conflict. Yet, so far, the provocations that have been appearing on both sides of the border have been met unusually with a little bit of restraint and caution, which is encouraging. Sid, always great to see you. How are you?
I'm good. Well, it's not really very encouraging, as you say.
No.
It's been a very troublesome 7 days, 8 days now. Think of the chronology of things.
And since what I kind of jumped into there, so we had where would you mark the return of the height of the
10th of November,
yeah.
Evening 6:25 local time, New Delhi sees a blast.
Yeah.
Less than 24 hours later, Islamabad witnesses a suicide bombing attack. Even before Islamabad, we have a string of crude bombs going off in Dhaka. And so it's not like the region is looking at some sort of better scenario if the past week is anything to go by. The restraint you're talking about, that's a very curious thing that's happening. You see, the Pakistani Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, quite directly, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's on record saying that India is behind the attack in Islamabad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's only India who's not saying that Pakistan is behind the attacks. And it's very curious that even though the police have given statements that the bombing has been traced back to the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is a Pakistan-based organization, it's being linked to Ansar Ghazwatul Hind, which strangely had died off back in 2019, another Kashmir-based organization. The reason why India is really not naming Pakistan is because Prime Minister Modi has dug himself into a rhetorical hole. If you recall, when we were reporting on Pahalgam, Prime Minister Modi, true to his boisterous self, said that
And
any act
this
of
was the major Kashmir attack.
yes, which was the major Kashmir attack. He pretty boisterously declared that his administration did that any act of terror hereafter will be considered an act of war.
Right.
Now, if
Like
India were
Obama's
to
red
say
line
that
to
Pakistan
draw.
is behind
Yeah.
it, then they'd have to go back to a war which at least President Trump isn't willing to approve of.
So he, what we've also heard is that, you know, India felt, or Modi felt like they did not quite get the better of Pakistan in this exchange, and is kind of itching to prove its mettle, that, you know, to punish Pakistan for, you know, what it done, and to disincentivize it, you know, from doing something similar again. And so looking for an opportunity, yet, as you said, President Trump has been, you know, he asserted that he had, you know, brought peace between the two, which is heavily contested claim. Curious if you have any take on the credibility of that claim. At the same time, the tension, like the relationship between the U.S. and Modi, or Trump and Modi, does not seem great. So why does Modi care so much what Trump feels about
Well,
this?
we've been hearing speculations. Obviously, we cannot put our finger to it,
Right.
but it's nearly an open secret at this time that Trump is pursuing a case against Modi's business ally Adani. And the DOJ has some documents, some files on him, which they are threatening to open against him, should Modi not fall in line. This has gone beyond speculation now. I mean, the leader of the opposition, several news outlets, everyone's been speaking about it. And people have been expressing surprise as to why would India really toe the American line so much. I mean, Mr. Modi is not having a good time in the press vis-a-vis how Trump has been behaving. Trump has left absolutely no opportunity, no stone unturned, not one opportunity to declare, oh, he's the real boss and he's the one who's telling how things should be. So it appears, I mean, it sounds logical that there is something that Trump has over Modi, which could very well be the Adani angle. We don't really know. But yeah, that's what's there. But having said that, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that equates to peace or equates to inaction or negotiation, diplomacy. You see, when we put these string of bombing attacks or whatever other kinds of attacks that may come, that have happened, you will recall that back earlier this year, before the Pahalgam attacks, we had in fact done an investigation saying Kashmir is sort of lighting up again.
Mm-hmm.
And then during Pahalgam, we spoke about how things are not as calm as they seem to be. If you really look back at another era, right after the 9/11 attacks, or right after the Pokhran nuclear tests which India conducted, and after 26/11 Mumbai attacks, India was under a similar kind of pressure, very strong diplomatic pressure from the US and the Western lobby to not react. I mean, they reached out, they told Pakistan as well to, hold your horses, don't do too much. But that was also a time when they did not go at it overtly, but several acts of cross-border irregular warfare, as they love to call it, that did happen. So it does not automatically equate to peace now.
So what has to happen to set it off, you think? Where do you, and what decisions could be made that would move it towards a more permanent peace?
We don't tangible which would move us towards permanent peace. It's not because it's not like the Kashmir issue is being discussed. It's not like trade is being given a front seat in all of this. It's not like the accords which have been cancelled, whether it's the water treaty, the Shimla Accord, and whatever else there is, those are in a limbo. So it's not like we have a lot of hard things to do. But beyond that, it's the political nature of the two administrations, which are, I mean, for that matter, we could extend the same logic to Bangladesh as well. We all know that Asim Munir needs a war because he has to justify why he's continuing to stay in power after ousting a democratically elected prime minister, Imran Khan. The rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric Mr. Modi espouses as a politician, not necessarily as a prime minister, but as a politician, he's very much in need of an enemy. It's not very different when I look at Bangladesh of late as well. As you will note that yesterday, the ousted Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she's been sentenced to death.
I saw that.
Yeah. Now, it's just a repeat of the cycle of violence. No one is out there saying that excesses weren't committed under Sheikh Hasina. But if you really look back, it's always one party coming to power and brutalizing the democratic process itself. The point being, if you aren't able to legitimize democracy in your own country, what hope do you have of trying to build a bridge with another country across the border?
Yeah. Yeah, I've always thought that there's actually, I'm curious for your take on this, a confluence of interest between people in India who want peace with Pakistan and the democratic movement in Pakistan. Because it really is as you said, the Pakistan military, it doesn't deliver for its people. It's an extractive entity that just kind of sucks wealth out of the country, fuels corruption that makes international and domestic investment very difficult. But in order to justify their ongoing existence, they need enemies, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's insurgents that they've created somewhere, or the boogeyman of India. And so all of those incentives then push themselves toward confrontation. But the movement towards democracy in Pakistan seems to be going worse than ever and completely backwards. And so it's very difficult for me to see how you get to a place where you're not just seeing regular conflict there.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that what would it take for democratic-minded people across the two borders to sort of raise a voice of peace? So Ryan, that's happened several times in the past. It's happened many, many times in the past. The much reported and much vilified Indus Water Treaty, that was a goodwill gesture from the Indian government back in the day, saying that, we need to do this with you. If you'll recall that even at the height of friction between the Yunus government and the Indian government here, India did agree to continue its power exports and do things like that. See, the principal problem since the very inception of these three countries, the partition, the independence and partition, has been that there hasn't been a continuous stretch of democratic governance in either Pakistan or Bangladesh. And there have been several movements, in fact, grassroots movements, cultural exchanges, military and intelligence level talks, which have tried to sort of resolve a lot of things through such a second channel, not a back channel. But it's impossible to carry that forward if the government in a country keeps changing. And then we have a character like a person like Asim Munir come up and completely negate the legitimacy of the democratic process till Imran Khan. Nobody here is insisting that Imran Khan was some big friend of India. No. Right. He too raised a lot of bogey against India, and India called him out, so on and so forth. Name it. Like, they have had this love-hate sort of relationship. But when the process is completely taken away of democracy, of election, of jurisprudence, of natural justice, then who are we actually talking to? So no, I mean, dark as it sounds, I don't think there is much of a hope for the two democratic people doing something.
And before I let you go, yeah, give us an update on the situation in Bangladesh. There's talk of an upcoming election. How are people feeling about Yunus and the post Sheikh Hasina situation?
So here, Bangladesh, I mean, until about a month back, the talk of elections was quite strong. Like in February, there'll be an election in February. They're quite certain there'll be an election and so on. But beginning November, private sources, sources close to our reporting, they have been indicating that might not be the case. Of course, it's out there. We'll know what happens. But having said that, see, the problem is that now the Yunus government has outlawed the Awami League, which is literally the largest party in Bangladesh. They don't have an equation. They have not fully legitimized the Jamaat-e-Islami, which was banned by Sheikh Hasina. They've not fully legitimized it. The sword of banning hangs on their head as well. So that's two big parties gone. As for the BNP, the Bangladesh National Party, the right of center party, their cadres are actually on the streets having fights and brawls with the New Citizens Party, NCP, which is seen as being close to Yunus. So I think the jury's out. Rather, the mob is out, as we still see.
So is Muhammad Yunus going to end up becoming another Nobel Prize winning dictator? Is that
He already was one.
Right.
I mean, the time he got the Nobel Prize was the time that he installed dictatorship over there. There is, and curiously enough, nobody ever raised the question that is there such a precedent in Bangladeshi law of appointing a principal advisor or chief advisor? In what capacity is it really continuing? And this is not the first time that he is in the position that he is. The last time that he came to power riding on the back of a civil society government, he continued for far too long, and it had to end in not very pleasant ways.
Yeah. Well, here we are. All right. Well, Siddharthya, Roy, I always appreciate chatting with you and hearing from you.
Yeah, I hope I made some sense. Too much happening here.
I think you certainly did, as much as you can in this situation. So thanks so much. And thank you to everybody out there for watching the Tuesday morning live stream. As always, if you can support our journalism, please do. You can go to donate.dropsitenews.com. If you supported our legal defense fund for the suit that we're defending in the Owen Jones case, I wanted to say thank you for that. The explosion in support has been gratifying and is really going to enable us to fight this with everything that we have. We expect that we are going to prevail in it, and so again, thank you. That's what makes it possible to fight. If you haven't become a paid subscriber, go ahead and do that and go to dropsitenews.com. On behalf of all of my colleagues here, thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.